Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone that joined today's live event organized by PEFA Secretariat to discuss the insights from Africa region based on the PEFA Global Report on PFM launched in 2022. The report uses PEFA data to highlight the PFM challenges and successes and is available on PEFA website in 3 languages, in English, French, and Spanish. I'm Sylvia Kirova from PEFA Secretariat, and here today are my colleagues Srinivas Gorazada and Richard Sutherland, who will guide us through the findings of the global report and help us understand better the outcomes and key messages from the report. We would like to thank everyone that joins today's event and encourage you to participate actively through posting your questions and comments on the live chat. Starting with Srinivas, PEFA data is very rich. We have more than 770 reports that are published on PEFA website. From them, 340 are for Africa region. That makes it 40% of all available reports. Can you tell us, based on this data, what are the trends in PFM in Africa region and how countries improve their PFM system compared to the trends around the world?
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and wonderful connecting with you and through you to everyone. And you said it right, Sylvia, the PEFA data set is so rich. The more you go into it, the wealth of information you gather out of it, the messages you take out of it is unlimited. And this is something which we always had with us, the accumulation of PEFA data on the PEFA website. And for the first time for the last couple of years, we have been producing this global report on public financial management, unpacking these messages from the information, putting it all together in an easily digestible web page where one can easily navigate to where one wants to reach. And this is fantastic that we are now talking about trends in Africa, which come out very distinctly in the global report. And I'll suggest all participants to look at the global report on the PEFA website. If I come to the trends in public financial management, what's happening? So PEFA enabled us know what's happening in PFM world, at least for the past 20 years of its existence, since we have the data set. What you see is good news. Countries have consistently over time been improving their PFM systems. Efforts are yielding results. That's the good news. That's the good news globally. That's the good news also in Africa. They have made significant progress over the past 1.5 decade or so. Now, is this progress to the level that one would expect? Is work done? Probably we can do better. And it is definitely work in progress, because if you add up the PEFA scores in the region and look, they overall at an aggregate level, you don't really see a trend of saying that the PFM systems are at an internationally highest level standards. It's not there in any region. It's not there in Africa as well. On the top of it, Africa region generally lags a little bit in terms of average PEFA scores with the rest of the regions. But that's understandable. If you look at the PFM reforms in Africa, the emphasis governments have been placing, and with the support of development partners in some cases, has been largely a phenomenon of last 15-20 years or so in a very significant way. And also a lot of success stories and progress is happening in the recent past. So from that perspective, the storyline is on the expected lines. Good progress, more work to be done in the times to come, and an optimism when you look into the future. Now, if you also look at what are the areas where Africa as a region has done well on PFM reforms, if you take the first indicator, aggregate expenditure outturn, which means does government spend as it planned at a total number wise level? Actually, Africa is doing fairly well on this indicator when compared to many other indicators. It's one of the high performing indicator in Africa when compared to others. That's good news, but obviously one has to be a little cautious on that, because yes, the aggregate it's matching up well, but if you go into a little bit details, that's the composition of expenditure, the deviations are more. Revenue outturn deviations, they are more. So it's a kind of a mixed bag story, though the aggregate expenditure storyline is looking something pretty good. On a similar lines, if you typically look at budget preparation process, this is an area over past several years, Africa has made really good progress, both in terms of having a stronger budget preparation process and also using internationally appropriate budget classification. Right? So which means you have sound budget processes in place. Obviously, one would also look at like, okay, governments are preparing budgets well, but are they executing well? Yes, I agree with you that governments are tending to prepare budgets better than they execute, and that's a work in progress as we move forward. Then let me also mention, does government budget or financial report cover the kind of all aspects? It's, while there are some gaps, one of the important aspects is, these days we are talking is about debt. What one would assume in the current days is debt management being a weakness in PFM systems in many of the developing countries. What you see in Africa is debt management scores rather better, rather well. What does it mean? It actually means governments are investing a lot of effort into getting processes for debt management in place. While under the same pillar of management of assets and liabilities in PEFA framework, debt management scores high, whereas asset management scores very low in that pillar across Africa. This is the same trend globally as well in a way. But why is this happening? It is happening because of these conscious efforts by government to improve the processes. That brings back to the point, like, does debt management automatically lead to improved debt management, lead to better debt sustainability? Obviously, it's a different story, because you would have debt management process is one aspect of the bigger puzzle of improved debt sustainability in a country, in which debt management does play an important role. So that's the overall story. I would say there are very good areas where Africa has made progress. There are areas which are still work in progress, but the overall outlook looks very positive.
Now, coming to Richard with the question on the global report on PFM. The global report on PFM 2022 was issued during COVID-19. The global pandemic caused a lot of problems for all countries in their PFM performance. That is why the global report is speaking about crisis budgeting and the trends and tools used by different countries. Richard, can you tell us more about the trends and tools used in Africa and around the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. So indeed, the report was published using data around about COVID period, the time when COVID crisis emerged, between 2019 up to 2022 when the report was published. Now, as you said, the report really tries to emphasize the significant impact that the COVID crisis had on the budgeting process, PFM system more broadly. And it starts by emphasizing the key issues, the typical challenges that PFM systems usually respond to when there's a crisis like COVID. Starting with, for example, the significant impact in the erosion of the assumptions that go into the budget, the numbers that are used to project what the budget numbers should be. All of these projections are no longer valid during a crisis. And so the question then is, how credible, how reliable is a budget during crises? And more so, what are the available tools that can be used to respond to a crisis in these circumstances? And so the two broad things to maybe point to that the report tries to summarize. On the one hand are the key trends. What are the actual factual impacts of crises on the budget? And here, chapter 2 of the report really tries to leverage data collected from the PEFA reports, data collected through different regional, let's say, surveys, and also regional partners who've collected data on budget deviation and so on, to summarize the statistical impact of crises on budget. And what we found is that, as is typical, during crisis moments, there's a significant deviation of actual expenditures from planned expenditures. Between 2019 and 2020, for example, the deviations, whether positive or negative, let's call it absolute deviation, rose significantly from around about 8% all the way to about 13%. And what that means in PEFA terms is that we move away from what you would typically classify as a B, a score, to what is a C score. And in PEFA language, a C score is really a basic level of performance. So that implies that countries moved away from relatively good international performance in terms of managing the outturn of both the expenditures and the revenue outturns to a level where they were barely managing to maintain the basic performance in that area. And so the question is obvious, no? During crises, how can governments reduce this significant variation that sort of undermines the entire effort that goes into preparing a credible budget? More importantly, though, one important nuanced information that came up out of this study is really how deviation was defined. On the one hand, one would expect that during a crisis, you would see a large increase in unplanned spending. However, what we found is that across countries, especially in Africa, the spending differed. In some countries, there was significant overspending, but in others, there was significant underspending. This is nuanced. Now, why did some countries overspend while others underspend? And so here, the report went into a little bit more detail to try to explain that it was due to some extent, the type of crisis that COVID was. There was a supply side shock where people was providing less services due to the lockdown, but then there was a demand side shock when there was less people out in the streets to buy and purchase services and so on. So these two dynamics really affected different countries in very different ways. And so that came up in the report and the data that was discussed. I mean, I encourage you to look at the report because it really had some interesting stories in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Srini, could you list few of the biggest problems in Africa that you evaluate or consider as the biggest PFM challenges for the region?
That's a very important question, Sylvia. So before I list out based on the global reports on PFM and my own assessment, the problems, significant problems in Africa on PFM, let me first say that most of the PFM problems are have technical solutions. They are problems which can be solved through a technical solution, which everybody knows actually. What is more difficult is the political economy challenges around PFM systems. PFM systems never operate in isolation. They operate in the overall environment. Bringing everything together will make the technical solutions work, and that's something which one need to take into consideration, not just in Africa, but everywhere. And I see more and more countries being aware, governments being more appreciative of this requirement and trying to arrange their activities in a way that the technical solutions yield their results. Now, let me pick up few problems which practically means the indicators where countries in Africa are scoring a bit lower on PFM systems. First is the expenditure arrears issue. Expenditure arrears is unique in Africa if you compare to the global landscape. You don't hear that level of problem about this elsewhere in the world when compared to Africa. What you see in Africa is two aspects. One, a difficulty in managing expenditure areas and keeping it at a reasonable level. And two, even knowing how much is the expenditure areas. And the combination of it is a kind of a major problem. Like in many countries, you find expenditure areas in excess of 10% of total expenditure in the past 2 out of 3 years. And that, again, is only the expenditure areas which you know. And let us think about what is not even known. What's the solution there? Probably the solution, the technical solution is treated as better internal control and a stronger IFMIS system, which is perfectly good. It works. IFMIS system, a financial management information system, can work. It will work only when it is implemented the way it is expected to be. Like typically, there should not be opportunity to do transactions outside the system or commitments outside the IFMIS system. As long as you do that and create an internal control environment appropriate, the expenditure areas problem can be resolved. That would be my first point. The second would be public procurement. Public procurement has been globally a challenge, and it's a major challenge also in Africa, typically considering the scale of investment, the scale of money spent by government, public sector on public procurements as a percentage of GDP. It's significant. So the quality and processes for improved public procurement is. The good news is that Africa has been doing well in the recent past in terms of improvements, but still the overall level, there's much more to be done, kind of a thing. So that would be my second point. Third point, I would talk a little bit about fiscal transparency of it. We know that Africa has been doing really well when compared to past in budget documentation, having the right kind of information to make a budget. Now, but is that information really available to public? So the access of fiscal information to public is an area where Africa is not doing as well as it can. This is not, again, a very difficult problem to solve also. Once you have the commitment to it, you can always work on and put the information out of it. And that's happening in many countries. That would be my third point. Fourth would be, let me talk a bit about the whole financial reporting environment. I call the financial statements, accounts and financial reporting as the most technical and least political, an aspect least susceptible to political economy issues, because nobody really worries too much in normal situations about whether a good accounting reform or financial reporting statements reform should be taken place. And this is an area where a lot of improvements these days are happening with implementation of IPSIS accrual accounting in many countries and various reforms. But this is an area still work in progress and can be significantly improved. Last is the closure of accountability chain I would talk about a bit. That's about how legislatures are scrutinizing the audit reports. So this is like, there's a lot of effort put in producing the supreme audit institutions, producing audit outputs, but there is a clear gap in legislatures reviewing the financial statements and audit reports. So partly it is time, partly it is the overall environment and the institutional structure, but the optimal value through the public accountability process, through the legislature, through the parliament, that's not taking place. For example, budgets are taken much more seriously and reviewed by the legislatures when compared to financial statements and audit report. So this is an area, again, Africa can do quickly well and make progress.
Thank you very much, Srini. It's very good that you listed the problematic areas in Africa, and we really appreciate that you gave some recommendations or some thoughts about how this could be solved. So thank you so much, and we are moving back to Richard and the Global Report on PFM. Richard, from the key messages from the Global Report, we can see that the fiscal discipline is really important. Can you tell us more about fiscal discipline during crisis versus fiscal discipline in normal times?
Thank you, Sylvia. Now, as you know, fiscal discipline is one of the three large outcome areas that the PEFA framework responds to, and PFM systems generally strive to achieve. And fiscal discipline really tries to describe the situation where the expenditures and the arrears, debt, all of these are done within a sustainable macroeconomic framework. So the question is, are countries or were countries able to maintain what is close to sustainable during COVID, right? The short answer is very rarely were countries able to maintain macro fiscal discipline during COVID. In most instances, we can break down macro fiscal discipline in maybe three areas. One is on the expenditure side. Let's start with the revenue side. Revenue outturn. The majority of countries were affected in one way or the other in terms of revenue outturn. In some instances, regular sources of revenues were completely disrupted. Services were not going on anymore, so there was nothing to tax. The tax revenues were significantly reduced. However, in other cases, there were unexpected, unanticipated sources of revenue, particularly through grants and donor support. So there was an inflow of donor support, especially in some countries that were affected in Africa. So the picture again in the revenue side is nuanced, but still the revenues were significantly affected, tax revenues. On the expenditure side, during normal times, you would expect that you plan according to what was budgeted for, both in terms of composition and levels. But again, during a crisis like COVID, health expenditures went through the roof. Vaccines needed to be accelerated in terms of acquisition and procurement. So the response forced many governments to went beyond the fiscal rules that were in place before. And so this brings to, therefore, the very important point is, how do you balance flexibility to respond to crises like COVID and accountability to ensure that the PFM system is able to ensure appropriate use of resources? To a large extent, PFM is largely trying to ensure that government resources are used responsibly, transparently, and so on. And so there are these PFM rules that try to do that. And so these tools that we spoke of earlier, during normal times, they may be viewed as malpractice if they're abused, and rightly so. But when there's a crisis, their use, the proper use becomes very critical. Otherwise, governments are unable to respond to these uncertainties that may come up from time to time. So overall, the narrative is, it's important to have these tools at hand, but it's important to also regulate and use them properly to respond to the crisis when they do come. And so the big lesson is really preparing for crises before the crises strike. So having clear, consistent rules in place, for example, for emergency procurement, for emergency treasury operations. How do you manage cash when you have a shortage of operations, government operations? Also, interim accounting and reporting accountability mechanisms. How do you structure the PFM system such that it can be responsive to crises without compromising these assurance mechanisms, these mechanisms in place to allow for accountability and transparency and so on. And so after the crisis, COVID crisis, many teams, countries have now started looking at how to make PFM more resilient to crises, how to build in, before the next crisis, these mechanisms to quickly transfer cash to where they need to go, to quickly build in these risk insurance mechanisms, these contingent financing mechanisms, so that whenever there's a disaster, you can quickly draw down the cash, you can quickly draw down the budget needed to respond to these crises, all while maintaining that PFM environment that ensures good fiduciary management, good management of cash and transparent management of cash. And so you're talking about interim accounting and reporting, interim audits in case there are certain high-risk areas, emergency procurement. All these things are necessary to ensure fiscal discipline in the long run. But it cannot be done during the crisis. It has to be done before the crisis so that you can respond quickly and effectively to a crisis next time.
Thank you, Richard. And yes, it's true. The country should be very well prepared in order to avoid the stress when the crisis comes. Now back to Srini with the question about PEFA. How does PEFA, how important is PEFA for all countries and for Africa region? For the PFM performance, for everything?
As you said in your introduction, Sylvia, so PEFA is extremely popular tool from the numbers in Africa. 40% of global reports are all, PEFA reports are all coming from Africa region as such, which is an vindication of the fact. And what we see now is an emergence of a new trend of not just doing standalone PEFA assessments, but PEFA assessments clubbing with one or more supplementary frameworks. For example, PEFA along with PEFA gender. So as a combination, or PEFA with climate, having all three together, main PEFA with climate and gender. This is a trend which is going very strong, and I see that trend going to grow faster. I would also say that Africa has been the flag bearer in terms of consistency in repeat assessments. Many countries go through a recommended timeline of 4 to 5 years to get a kind of a new assessment, and many of the public financial management reform processes and projects of government, they're all informed and monitored. The results matrix uses PEFA indicators or PEFA dimensions to monitor that. This is fantastic and a good practice as such. While it's not an intention of PEFA, one thing I always felt as a major advantage with the framework is PEFA being the gold standard PFM framework is probably the best way to learn for the first time or upgrade your PFM skills. I learned the overall picture of public financial management only through a kind of going through the PEFA processes as such, and I could see that happening a lot. So whenever we do conduct training programs in Africa on PEFA, it's intended to equip them with learning the PEFA framework. But what we see is strong public financial management experts who understand not just their narrow space of their own work, but how their aspect of PFM relates to every other aspects. Because PFM is itself a very broad area with, it's an interdisciplinary process. You need policymakers, you need administrators, economists, accountants, auditors, political economy experts, everything collaborating and working together. And in the budget cycle, everything is related to another because it's one cycle. So it is that overall picture is something which everybody need to have, and that's coming very strongly by greater number of PEFA assessments taking place in countries and equipping government officials and various stakeholders with the required PFM knowledge. Let me also conclude this particular point by also mentioning that we have the PEFA research competition, which is something bringing together application of PFM knowledge. So we sponsor PEFA research and through unpack issues which will inform not just the PEFA Secretariat and the PEFA related work, but the broader PFM world. And that's the direction in which the PEFA Secretariat is moving. The PEFA partners have actually authorized the expansion of PEFA's role as a global knowledge hub in the next phase of the PEFA program, which will be starting from 1st June of 2023. And we expect to be there for everyone who is interested in PFM knowledge.
Thank you, Srini. Yes, there are a lot of new nuances in the PEFA program, and we are really looking forward to the phase 6 of PEFA program. Could you tell the participants in today's event what is the next from PEFA? What are the latest news, ongoing activities, and what they could expect in the near future?
Sure. Let me just flag a couple of them. So I call it a sort of multiverse world. Is PFM a multiverse world? Are there alternate universes where one is struggling to move from one universe to another? This is the kind of thinking we were having some time back, looking at the sheer volume of PFM diagnostic tools. So what we did is take stock of existing PFM diagnostic tools globally available and putting them together into how do they structure and relate to each other, relate to PEFA. For example, if you in a country, if procurement is a challenge as notified, as identified in a PEFA assessment, what would be the next step? Would it be conducting a BAPS assessment and going into a kind of a reform kind of a thing? And what other aspects need to be related? How does public investment management relate to PFM, the diagnostics relate to it? And the new emerging areas like service delivery areas, the service delivery tools in health sector, education sector, how do they relate with the broader PFM storyline? So we are coming out with this global report on diagnostics tools on public financial management and opportunities to use them more effectively. That's going to come up pretty soon. That's one thing I would like to mention. Then we are targeting to look at the next iteration of global report on public financial management towards the end of the calendar year 2023. So we are exploring on diving a bit more deep into various nuances of messages that are coming through. We will again put it out in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. And we would make available summary information probably through other channels in other languages as well. So we are looking for greater dissemination of this knowledge and working together with everyone interested in PFM area.
Thank you, Srini. Thanks to our discussants, Srini and Richard, for their inputs and for their thoughts on PEFA program, on insights from Africa region, on all the upcoming PEFA events. We are waiting for you to join us on the next PEFA events that will be announced on PEFA website, and you can check on www.pefa.org, or you can contact us for more information through the services at pefa.org. Thank you for joining us today and for your interesting questions, for the posts with valuable comments. You are always welcome to PEFA events.